Whether it was our board directors or whether it was the questionnaires coming in from our prospective customers, everything equated cybersecurity with data and data security. And that's really like an emotional tickler for the general public, because most people deal with cybersecurity if their identity might be stolen. So privacy and data in particular is equated with cybersecurity for them. In critical infrastructure, it wasn't the case. And we were trying to say, how do we tailor our cyber program to those more destructive and sabotage type critical infrastructure attacks without looking dismissive of this massive media narrative about data theft and the industry? And the answer again is not, oh, that's not important. It's putting it in context and explaining why, while you've identified your data security risk and you care about it, we're really focused on sabotage or whatever it may be.
Hi, my name is Ian Tian. Welcome to Tools for Tech Leaders, a podcast for C-suites and tech decision makers to connect with ideas that resonate and can be useful. Our guest today is Jerry Perullo, who's the former Chief Information Security Officer at Intercontinental Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange. He's the interim CISO of Silicon Valley Bank. He's the founder of Adversarial Risk Management and a professor of practice at Georgia Tech University on cybersecurity. So excited to have Jerry Perullo, who's former Chief Information Security Officer for Intercontinental Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange. He was the interim CISO of Silicon Valley Bank, and he's the founder of Adversarial Risk Management. Jerry, so great to have you on our podcast today.
Oh, thanks, Ian. Yeah, it's absolutely great to be here.
Yeah, so we'd love to learn about your career, your different learnings. I think maybe to start off, because it's also kind of attached to your philosophy, can you tell us a little bit about adversarial risk management and how you kind of came to your current business from all the different learnings that you've had as a CISO in different organizations?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, we'll touch on a little bit more later, but just to bring the audience up to speed, I was a CISO of a large public company for over 20 years. And I was always pretty entrepreneurial, even within the company. It started with 40 people and ended with 10,000. So we had a lot of opportunities to really innovate. And I was known for doing a lot of that with my team. And we also governed cybersecurity for a lot of different subsidiaries that were very different with the same single, very efficient, lean team. And at some point during that, and speaking, and as we may touch on, I'm a professor of the practice at Georgia Tech in cybersecurity too. Somewhere in there, I coined this phrase, adversarial risk management. And it wasn't for the purpose of starting a company. It was actually because when I was briefing our board, for example, and talking to non-cyber people about the whole concept of cyber risk management, I couldn't help but think, if you're outside of cyber, you have to always think, this can't be totally new. There has to be some metaphors at least. This can't be that difficult. There has to be some kind of analogs that we can draw here. And as I did that, there are a lot of things about risk management, that you risk reward and so on, that you should apply and that you don't have to be a cyber expert for. But the one delta was that presence of the adversary, right? So like compared to whether it's financial exchange rates or tornadoes or anywhere in between, traditional risk management, you don't have someone on the other side that's constantly turning the knobs and trying to adapt to what you do to get over on you. So I started calling it adversarial risk management to try to trigger in people that come from a different discipline of risk management that it is different. Not everything, but something is. And that it's very iterative. You're never done in this world. The idea is figure out what they're going to do, stay one step ahead of it, and knowing that whatever you do at this moment is going to be worthless in a year. and then that's okay. That's just in the adversarial world. But you can have the consistency of a repeatable process. And so I had that phrase, and it really resonated with people. And so I started really liking that. And then as I came close to my 20th year anniversary and thinking about what I'm going to do next and evaluating all the different options, this gravity of starting a company and really creating a platform so that not only big enterprises, but especially smaller companies, growth stage, mid-market companies that don't have a cybersecurity team can adopt and automatically deploy that iterative strategy and stay ahead of adversaries and really leverage us as a centralized team that keeps up with the threat intelligence and what they're doing now to handle that part for them, and they could use their business acumen. So we've been building. So ultimately I said, let's do it. I got adversarial.com, which was a coup in itself and really cemented the name for me. And then we've been building this company, and I like to call it CISO as a platform. It's a SaaS platform, really targeting and co-founding non-cyber executives to empower them to do what they need and leverage our expertise on the back end to avoid having to build a whole department prematurely. So that's what we've been at. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, I'm very threat-centric, and it really does a lot to help companies figure out what they need to be worried about before they start worrying about which controls to deploy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What I thought I heard you say, it's about really understanding your security posture in the context of the threats that could be coming and the adversaries on the other side. And different organizations are going to have different adversarial risks. And how do you sort of mix and match those together to find the right patterns so that you're building something that fits your business versus somebody else's? Did I get that right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, and a lot of it is that if you either pay attention to cybersecurity news or don't do a good job of avoiding it, because it's such a blast these days, there's a lot, right? It's a fire hose. And I mean, I know just dealing in corporate governance and working with, we had, at ICE in particular, we had over 60 independent directors because we had a lot of subsidiaries with independent governance requirements. So there was this super set of directors around the world. And when you add them all up, I had so many inbounds that were, hey, I heard about the TalkTalk breach. Should we be worried about that? I heard about the Equifax breach. I heard about Sony Pictures and on. And so part of the game to me was making sure I was never defensive or dismissive in those inquiries. So the answer was never, oh yeah, that's unimportant, don't worry about it. The answer had to be either, that is very important and here's what we're doing, or good question. And let me put that in context of our program and bring it back to something we've already discussed and explain why it's not our top priority, but I don't blame you for asking. And so this whole idea of getting companies to upfront figure out, and I'll just jump right into it. We have 6 what we call threat objectives that we rate for each company. So sabotage versus data theft, versus extortion, customer targeting, like a SolarWinds. Are you a provider of trusted access to bigger targets than yourself, right? And fraud is another one, of course, and then just what we call resource hijacking. And walking through each of those, there's a different threat profile for every company. And it's not about just figuring out what you need to worry about. It's about figuring out the things that you can afford to not worry about, right? Because you have finite resources and time.
It sounds like responding to the market and inquiry about especially publicly traded companies or any sorts of critical infrastructure is super important. What do you think about this kind of you brought up SolarWinds? How do you think about this concept of security as marketing versus security as sort of obligation? And what do you think is changing with SolarWinds and the sort of litigation that's happening?
Yeah, we're definitely at a really interesting inflection point because a lot of what's driving interest in cybersecurity that's not organic, and organic means you got hacked, right? That's an organic interest in cybersecurity. But on the non-organic side, it's usually, and one of the reasons why I thought this was a good point in time to build a cybersecurity platform is that there's a lot of interest driven by what we call in the industry TPRM, so third-party risk management. And frankly, this might be a controversial stance, but I almost feel like it's overemphasized because of a few miscategorized high-level breaches. There's a few big breaches out there that were blamed on, it was a vendor and it was their fault. And then there's a long cycle in regulation. Once something sticks and once it's accepted as canon and, that's a fact, even if later the intelligence shows that the vendor maybe didn't have a big role in it, the train's already left the station. Legislation is being drafted. There's, Capitol Hill inquiries. And long story short, a lot of the banking regulations have a huge emphasis on third-party risk management. So the banks are getting a lot of pressure from the federal regulators on how are you ensuring that your vendors are not presenting cyber risk to you. And they, in turn, are fanning out to this whole, vendors, whether they're technology or not, no less cybersecurity, all these questionnaires about cybersecurity. And that's driven a whole industry. And down through smaller companies, people are trying to figure out how do I not only tell a good story about my cyber risk management, but have a good story, actually have the controls in place. It's almost a cyber arms race where your story better be as good as the competitors, because procurement is having such strong decision-making power in a lot of these large companies that sometimes something like that, like whether or not you're passing these screening filters, can be a bigger differentiator about whether or not your product is adopted versus a competition, rather than features and function, or even value in many cases. So I think amid that backdrop, a lot of people trying to close business and running into those walls have realized that there's almost a marketing angle to it. So in addition to answering the questions, and instead of saying yes, no on these questions, it's turned into a whole lot of kind of chest-thumping statements like, oh yeah, here at Acme Inc., cybersecurity is of the highest priority to us, and we devote cutting-edge efforts and stay abreast of the latest technological advance. I'm just spouting stuff off because I've read so many of these statements. And that's become pretty common. Marketing is paired up with cyber, and it's extended all the way into 10Ks and annual statements as well, despite the fact that annual reports are usually full of so many risk factors. Right? You look at a public company, most of it is this may go wrong and this may happen, and cautioning people. But nonetheless, there's usually some cyber wording now that just talks about how robust the program is and how important they value it. And what we're seeing with the SolarWinds case, and just to spell it all out for some people that aren't acclimated to it, after SolarWinds was breached, and let's just say caused damage to some of their customers, and argued by the Security and Exchange Commission, caused damage to their shareholders, the SEC has launched a civil suit against not only SolarWinds, but their chief information security officer explicitly. And among other things, it's really specifically citing a lot of that marketing-esque cyber bravado and I'll say it was very standard. I don't think that they were over the top at all in their wording. And a lot of companies have been issuing that not only under private cover to prospects, but on their websites and their security pages and all of that. And that's all being called into question. And I think already the damage is done and people will revisit that and they'll tone down some of that wording and make sure that there isn't potentially misleading or false advertising and embellishment in there. And if the SEC prevails, and who knows, I mean, my prediction is that they won't prevail as written, and it'll be somewhere in the middle, maybe some kind of settlement. But if they were to prevail and those statements were found to be downright fraudulent, then it would just have a massive watershed moment for the industry.
It's super important, unfolding sort of in real time. And the theme that you and I have talked about in the past is this concept of sort of KWAD emptor, like buyer beware. So when you think about M&A in acquiring a company and sort of not knowing their full cybersecurity posture, and you're kind of getting this marketing as upfront, or if you're a CISO joining an organization and saying, "Hey, I'm going to be accountable for the security of this enterprise," or you're an investor. I mean, private equity investors or strategic acquirers are thinking about purchasing these businesses. What are some principles that you might pass on to other folks thinking about M&A, thinking about taking new roles? Like, how do you sort of think about what you can't see as you approach a cyber to new organization?
Yeah, it is really interesting because M&A is really, so in my class, when I go through third-party risk management, I make the statement that M&A is a type of third-party risk management. I even say that corporate governance is third-party risk management. Anywhere where you have to take someone's word for it, and then you get into let me have a trusted third party validate that, or do whatever I can. That's all third party, at least in the common noun literal sense. And so that's the way. So I think there's a lot of parallels there. And when it comes to M&A, having been on both sides of that many times in the cyber equation, I got to go from reading things that are online and kind of the TPRM questionnaire responses into due diligence, which is deeper, right? It's under private cover and you have deal rooms, data rooms, but still. I mean, there's probably some people that would try to argue this, but I don't think it holds any water at all. I mean, during due diligence, there's still embellishment. Somebody selling a company, they're gonna paint stuff up to about the extent that they possibly can, and private equity is no stranger to that either. So there's always a different look when a deal closes, and you get inside and really see it, and it's just a fact. And I don't see deals getting unwound over that. It's just everyone knows that you're getting the rosiest possible picture before you buy the new car, and then after you take it off the lot, things can change. And so having seen that, it's made me really think, and we implemented an M&A playbook out of the cybersecurity team. It's actually pretty interesting. On my old team, the one who owned it was the head of the red teaming, the adversarial testing, the ethical hacking, and they owned the M&A playbook as well. And the way that we broke it down, I think is pretty interesting and useful, whether it's a small deal or large. We put it into these time slices, and we actually started with the idea of corporate development. So long before security is even spoken to, people are just shopping around, they're talking to bankers, they're hearing about, let's call it deal flow, kicking the tires on a few things, and most of them, they're never going to move forward. But we said, even at that point, they can have some info. And what we did was benchmarking. We said, if a company is in a general similar industry to us, and that's important, then we would expect them to have a headcount security of X ratio compared to total. And we would say we'd expect their investment in cybersecurity, defined by this numerator, to be generally this ratio of total OPEX, operational expenditures. And then they can come in and out of, kicking the tires and evaluating deals without ever letting us know, and at least get an early precursor of whether there may be synergies or dyssynergies in cybersecurity to the deal. And I think that step alone was pretty powerful, because I hear some CISOs really demanding to be brought into all of the early evaluations, and I think that's just unrealistic. As a security risk manager, I advocate for keeping the kimono as tight as you can, right, and closing it off, not bringing anybody else in. So I think it's fair for deal teams to not bring everyone in. And then after that, the next stage was, of course, due diligence. And it's really interesting, especially being in heavily regulated jurisdictions and markets with regard to antitrust law. There's a lot of sensitivity to gun jumping. And before an antitrust review is done, not beginning the integration prematurely. And counsel's take on that will generally be, don't do anything, don't talk to anyone. But if you define some things up front in your approach, and for example, you say, during due diligence, we are going to run this research about a target, this cybersecurity research. To be specific, threat intelligence. You can go to your provider and say, you don't have to admit that you're thinking about buying Acme Inc., but you could just say, we may do business with Acme Inc., and so we want to get a profile of their cybersecurity risk. We want to run queries around deep and dark web talk to see if anyone is trading in their stolen information. We can add them as a vendor to a third-party risk management attack surface tool. And of course, you could submit questionnaires and all of that. And also talking with them through that threat profile. What do they think they should care about? And your own business development people can say, well, here's what they would add to us, and so here's what the cyber risk would be. I think you can do all of that. And if you come in too late and you just tell the lawyers, hey, I heard, before we go into due diligence visit, I'm going to put them into this tool, they'll panic. Whoa, stop the presses. No, anti-gun jumping. But if you go through this conversation before you have a deal in the targets, and you walk through a framework and you say, here's what we're going to do, and you go ahead and pressure test that. Will that tip our hand? Will that show anyone there might be a deal? Oh, maybe we can tailor things a little differently. Then you're ready for that, and you can do that, and you can learn a whole lot. And then on deal close, same thing again, we have to do in advance. On the deal close, all the folks who over-embellished are really worried about that. And now that it's time to show what's real, you'll get a lot of pushback. And so if you go in and say, okay, the deal's closed, now we're going to go examine everything, the stall tactics are it's just an emotional thing of, well, hold on, we can't reveal this yet, or we don't want you to come in too quickly, or you might break something and the existing customers might get lost. So having a procedure up front that says things like, at the deal close, you're onboarded into our bug bounty program. Or at the deal close, we're going to have a red team engagement. We're going to do a compromise assessment. So it's not personal. We do this with every target, and you can get right to work. I think that's massive. And just letting people know, look, what was said before is done. We've closed on this deal. Now we're all family. So don't worry about it. We're going to see your warts. We're going to see all the ugly parts of it. And culturally getting that point where people don't feel apprehensive is pretty critical.
Wow, that's incredible. I didn't even think about so many of those issues. And it's super interesting that you have the head of the red team leading the M&A. Can you speak a little bit about that? There's a lot of discussion in the market about cyber risk maturity models, as well as sort of red teaming and sort of live exercises. How do you think about the trade-offs between the two, and when should you use which, and what is the general principle, whether you're a CISO or a C-suite exec that needs to kind of get their head around risk and security?
Sure. Yeah. That's a really good point. I like to recast it, right? Frameworks and compliance-based programs versus spot testing and red teaming. And to put it in a layperson's term, the former would be, here's a best practices checklist, let's walk through it, and if and when you've satisfied that, we think your security is pretty good, versus let's just try to hack in. And if we're successful, you have issues. I mean, the quick and dirty of it is that after having done all of the above repeatedly in multiple businesses and subs, I'm a much stronger fan of the latter, of try to break in right away. I think the mature diplomatic statement is to say you have to do all of them and they all have their place. But I often look at it as bottoms up versus top down. So the framework-based approach, on balance, hasn't had a lot of that threat profiling. So you have the exact same framework being applied to a company that houses sensitive data as critical infrastructure that's worried about availability and running the power grid, as a software supplier who's delivering privileged binaries into government targets. And I can just tell you from the adversarial viewpoint, like the techniques, tactics, and procedures that adversaries use, they're very different, depending on whether you're trying to steal some data, listen in on a private conversation, destroy the earth, actually raise a company, or extort them, or commit fraud, or whatever it may be. They're very different. So the thought that the exact same 300, 500 bullet point framework is going to be appropriate for all of them doesn't hold a lot of water. And I also find that in the process of going through compliance with those frameworks, companies it takes a while. It takes years in many cases. And if you have a 500 element framework and you've made it to element 400, and then you have an attacker and they're taking advantage of your lack of control 403 or 409, then you have a big problem. So while I wouldn't ever discourage someone from pursuing a framework-based attestation as well, especially if they're a large company that are just going through a lot of tick box TPRM exercises, I think it's vital, if you actually want to not get breached, to also do the top down, the red team exercise. And the way to frame that is around that threat profile. And so if you're in fintech and handling transactions, then there's a point where you need to say, okay, we're not a geopolitical target. We're not super worried about sabotage. We have a limited amount of private data, whether it's financial data or private data or healthcare data or all the different types, but we're super worried about transactional fraud. If you make that statement, then you go to a red team and say, we're worried about fraud. We want you to study where fraud happened at a similar fintech platform in the recent past, look at the techniques and procedures and tactics that they employed, and try them out here in our environment. Because when you go through that, first of all, it'll work. Almost every time, the first time you go through that, you'll find problems, and they will be able to show a path through which they could consummate whatever the problem is, fraud in this case. But more importantly, you'll have maybe 7, maybe 10 things that come out of that you need to fix. And you can jump on those, and you can tie them when you're talking to non-cyber execs. You can tie them very clearly to, look, we have to make this change because otherwise they'll take all the money, right? Look at a screenshot of the red teamer doing it. And people get motivated when you do that. And then you can go back to your 500 list framework without a doubt. But if my money's on the line and I'm worried about it, and I'm worried about a vendor, I want to see that they exercised a scenario that keeps me up at night, found problems, fixed them, tried it again, and now had a better result.
That kind of so it sounds like it's really about tailor fitting the risk profile of the organization and saying, hey, you've got your checklist, but you've also got your red team and real exercise and simulations to really pressure test the posture, because everything changes in a year. It's all relevant because everything's different. So maybe just to double click on that, can you talk a little bit about in a year everything's different and this sort of this evolution of cyber risk versus cyber defense?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's super important. And I'll tie it back to, when you earlier started to touch on those being fundamentally different approaches of framework versus the red team testing too. So when it comes to regulation explicitly, pre-cyber, I think a lot of, especially financial services regulation, was cast as either prescriptive or principles based. And the first times I heard about that, especially outside the cyber context, generally, the U.S. regulators were known for being more prescriptive, and some of the EU and the U.K. in particular regulators for being more principle-based around general financial regulation. And it was kind of seen like principle-based was a little more lax. Right? They were giving you trust until you proved otherwise. And so there were arguments, and it was kind of a pendulum swing politically about whether regulation would be more principle-based or prescriptive. In cybersecurity, when regulation first came about, there were the same two camps, and there were the same arguments, and different people would take different approaches. But in hindsight, now, I think that you can't afford to do anything but be principle-based because of the adversarial nature that you just touched on. So to have a iterative program, that means that the controls that you really need to prioritize a year from now may be very different from the ones today. And having a prescriptive regulatory regime is really difficult for that, right? Because the legislative cycle is so long alone that even if people agree that there's some new controls that need to be reflected in regulation, it's going to take 3 to 5 years before they actually get on paper. So while I think that there should be political debates about the merits of principle versus prescriptive regulation in other areas, I think when it's cyber, it's unequivocal that you have to have principle-based regulations. And those principles are things like you need to adapt, you have to have threat intelligence, you need to observe what the adversaries are doing and do the latest things. So that under that same regulatory framework, 1 year, certain controls may satisfy it, and the next year, different controls will still satisfy the principles and thus get you through the regulatory exams. So to put that into practice, I think it's almost coincidence that the UK and the Bank of England in particular, having a very principle-based approach, thus happened to adopt a framework around cyber that really prized testing. So instead of just having this tick list of things that you have to do, and I mean, they had their questionnaires and all of that, like everyone too, but they implemented this program called CBEST, C-B-E-S-T, maybe it's 2013, 2014 timeframe, where they actually said, well, we want to red team you as a regulator. We want to try to break in and see what we could think. And if you wind back the clock, and maybe even some people today bristle at that. Are you nuts? There's no way I'm going to have the regulator try to break in. And I personally pushed back a lot. I remember going over to London and getting some of the pre-reads on that and kind of a town hall and feeding back and just stomping my feet. In no way. Some of the problems were, one, someone who's not an expert will take findings out of context and just beat us up about something that isn't really a top concern, and they're going to tie up our resources over nothing. Another was multinational. What if the Bank of England breaks in through a subsidiary in Singapore, and then I've got to explain to the Singapore regulators how a government entity in the UK broke in, and what kind of political imbroglio will that be? So I pushed back about a lot of it, and as long as possible. but ultimately capitulated and went through many cycles with that and totally had an about face on it. So in hindsight, it's phenomenal because and I also later welcomed even customer red teaming, which most people would again bristle at. And the reason I really like it in hindsight is that anything that's found through that, whether it's regulator driven or customer driven, but when they actually try to break in, if they're successful, you're very willing and happy to fix it, right? It's not the academic paper nebulous findings that you get out of a paper exam where half the team is saying, do I have to do this? It's a waste of my time. When you're actually talking about the data getting disclosed or the grid being able to be shut down or whatever it is, then you're all on the same team. You're very quickly going to fix that. And I found that regulators often, despite their reputation, were true to form on honoring that, okay, we found this, we're not pass-fail. We don't just want to know whether or not you had issues. We want to know your agility. How willing are you to fix things? And so as long as you're actually willing to react to the results that you get and fix them, then you perform very well in a principle-based regime. So that being born in, let's say the UK and then the EU, Holland adopted a similar testing program called TIBR, and then the whole EU has a variant of that called EU TIBR, and it's really taking off, which I'm very excited about. And then we mated them up during a hearing with the CFTC in the United States and brought over some of those folks. And then CFTC released new cybersecurity regulations in 2017, 18, that reflected an emphasis on testing, red teaming, penetration testing again. And so we're seeing it starting to really go viral. And I think that's hugely beneficial. And we should reflect that in our business-to-business relationships as well. And say, if regulators realize frameworks are kind of on the wane, testing is what we need to be doing, then we certainly should be doing it in our customer-to-vendor type reviews as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think, Mattermost, the company that I work at, we kind of began with customer red teaming. Like people would come in, we were open source, and they would just like, hey, you have to fix these. And you're like, you're right. And it was, it was great. It's a great relationship, and you build a lot of trust when you have those open red team relationships. In fact, we actually create custom mugs for anyone that actually finds a security issue and they get on our wall of fame. We customize it. So I think that's so important. Can you share a little bit, just for the folks that aren't quite as deep in cyber, what are examples of these evolutions, right? Like, hey, here's the kind of historical rear view facing requirements, and it totally misses this new class of risks and threats that happen. Like, what are examples of things that change over time?
Sure. Yeah. With sufficient time, I bet I could dream up a bunch. But even while you were asking, I started thinking password complexity. That's an easy one. I mean, even today, you see all kinds of warnings about how your password's only 8 characters. It really needs to be 15, or you need to have more uppercase and lowercase and more special characters, and you need to reset it. That's my favorite. You need to reset your password every 90 days or even more frequently. And I'd like to say that made sense in a certain threat environment. It makes sense where people are guessing your password over and over again. Right? So the old walk up to the computer, try one thing, try it a million times. But in order to get the number of tries that you really have to do to crack an 8-character password or a 10-character, you need to have some kind of programmatic way to be trying passwords. So as multi-factor authentication became really ubiquitous for anything external, that became pretty pointless. And then also, even just for like consumer-facing systems that may not have multi-factor authentication, when they lock your account after 10 tries, that really thwarts 10 billion tries or 10 trillion tries or however many it would be to actually guess a password. And the ironic thing is, you see these media reports about password complexity come out, and they'll often say 40% of people have really weak passwords, and here you can see them. And then they'll say, and a small number of people have really strong passwords, and here's what those look like. And the reason is that the adversarial evolution, was to keyboard capture, right? Or input capture, let's just say more generically. So it doesn't matter how strong your password is, somebody actually just captures everything that you type in. And so these reports would show from dumps from adversaries that would do key capture, and they would have these password databases, and they would capture them whether they were strong, weak, 400 characters, doesn't make a difference. It's capturing what's typed into the keyboard. And then people would mine this data to run these reports to say, look, these are good passwords and these are bad, ignoring the fact that they all ended up in the exact same dump. And that's what people are using now, is these password dumps that were captured off of keyboards. There's not, and it's not an explicit, exhaustive statement, but there's far less brute force guessing of passwords that would make weaker passwords more susceptible these days. And the exception is really deep in what we call the kill chain. If you're targeted by a really sophisticated adversary, then after they break in through the outside, and they gain internal privileges, and they're able to harvest your database of hashed passwords, and then they're able to export them to some GPU-assisted rig to try cracking your passwords for the next 6 weeks straight, then yes, they will crack the weaker passwords before the stronger ones. But by that point, generally in the kill chain, you probably already, the game is over.
That's a really cool word. Can you say more about that for the non-technical folks? What's a kill chain in cybersecurity?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm glad you revisited it because I didn't give a good citation there. It was Lockheed Martin, I believe, in their cyber program that coined it originally. This sequential process that people would have to go through in order to compromise a target. And it started with reconnaissance, just learning about a target. And then it got pretty explicit into the tradecraft of the day when it was created. And it was things like weaponization, so taking a otherwise benign file or document and arming it with some kind of malware. Command and control, so establishing a remote control to a computer. Persistence, so ultimately doing something so that even when the computer is rebooted or destroyed, that they would still have access. And then ultimately, the action on objectives, so the destruction or the stealing of the data or whatever it may be. And it was really a watershed paper at the time, and it was really helpful because it would just break these attacks down into these little pieces of it that helped you study all of them and find commonality among different adversaries and threat vectors. And it really set the tone for a lot of the learning that underpins a lot of modern cybersecurity. Now, that said, I think some weaknesses with the exhaustive, explicit original paper that nowadays, when you move forward, are that it was a bit prescriptive, if you will. It did have some tradecraft in there that has kind of fallen by the wayside. So what we do when we use it is we've genericized it into just 4 major areas. And it's things like reconnaissance, then how somebody's actually, like they have a delivery phase, and I think that's still true too. But delivery is now not just, are they emailing malware, but are they doing that or breaking in through your website or whatever it may be? That initial toehold, if you will. That's kind of a generic new kill chain phase for us. And then persistence is still around in the final action. Why it matters. If you heed my advice and do a lot of red teaming, if you find that at a peer, for example, let's say you're running critical infrastructure, that's always a fun one, defense industrial base, something like that. So my methodology is, well, what are you worried about? Well, we're worried about being destroyed here. We're worried about our company being shut down by a geopolitical adversary. Where has that happened before? So you look. And by the way, it doesn't have to be just a geopolitical theater. You could use that. You could use Russia against the Ukrainian power grid. Or you could look at North Korea against Sony Pictures. It doesn't just have to be nation state to nation state. You look at it. If you want to have a red teamer play that back in your environment, if you literally do that and you have someone emulate what Russia did to the Ukrainian power grid, then when they're successful, they'll have shut down the power grid. Not cool. So people shy away from that. Well, we don't want to test it. What if that sounds really dangerous? The kill chain is the solution to that. So instead, you take one of those and you break it down into each phase, which independently was relatively harmless, but all strung together caused the ultimate issue. And you just test each of those phases in isolation. So at the end of the day, your conclusions are things like the reconnaissance performed by Russia against Ukraine would also work against us. Look at this. We were able to mine LinkedIn and find who the systems engineers were. We were able to see the technology because your engineers were discussing in Reddit forum, looking for help with Postgres. We were able to map the infrastructure. Okay, we've learned something. Next, they were able to break in because they found some web vulnerabilities with vulnerable packages and they were web services were over permission. Let's test that. Yes, we're able to do the same thing. We haven't shut down the power yet. Right? And then the final thing was once they were in, they were to elevate privileges and click the power off button. And so here in our test, once in and given some assumed breach, let people have some permissions for that phase, they were able to elevate privileges and in maybe a non-production environment, find the power button. They didn't quite click it. You put that all together, you could have really good confidence that it's possible to have the same damage without actually taking on the risk.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm learning a ton from this conversation. When I think about like the C-suites, myself included, and we think about reconnaissance, we think about counterintelligence, we think about folks that, and as you discussed, like who's the sysadmin, who works there, who left there, who's going there, and all this public information on LinkedIn that really wasn't around a while ago. How do you think about threats from that reconnaissance, from that surveillance, where people are sort of opting in, whether it's on Twitter or LinkedIn, talking about their location, talking about the conferences they're at? Like, how do you think about that in the modern world? Like, how big a risk is it? Should we get off social media? Should we just get hardened in some way?
Yeah, great point here. I'll try to draw some metaphors in there at the same time. My general take is you got to meet people where they are. You got to adapt to the environment and not try to dictate it in cybersecurity. So I would say, that horse has left the barn. Social media is what it is. And rather than trying to claw back the information that's being disclosed in just culturally these days. I mean, you can certainly have some efforts to that, and you can have a team that's trolling LinkedIn, and maybe you come up with some reasonable compromise where you say, look, yes, you can say you work here. Yes, you can say you work on cool stuff. I don't want to limit your career opportunities, but please just don't put the version of Postgres that we run, right? You can have some kind of guardrails, and that makes sense. But in general, people do and will continue to share more than you would ideally want. Now, if you're defense industrial base or certainly government, then maybe you can dictate those requirements. But in the private sector, I don't think you can. What I think you have to do instead is to recognize that that information is out there and no longer consider it sacred or a key. So so one of the things we do at Adversarial, part of that like custom fitting to the threat profile, is we dynamically generate policy statements. So if you're a data theft risk and it's really high to you, then we should give you this big data classification and label every doc and all that, sure. But if you're not, let's not do that to you because you're just not really going to follow the policy. So in the process of that, we have social media policy, and it's thinking about exactly this. And so we recommend people have a policy that's pretty stringent if you are really worried about sabotage. But if you're like the other 99% of companies, it's a lot more liberal. And it says things like, don't share on social media photos from inside the company. I think that's reasonable, but it's fine to mention that you work here and so on, has do's and don'ts. So I think it's more important to know and to teach people that when they get a call and they reference things to try to build trust and rapport that used to be secret and used to be like, oh yeah, I work in the Milan office and so I'm trying to log in, I'm having trouble right now. If they start throwing out info that it used to be like, oh, I looked on SharePoint. You think, oh yeah, we use SharePoint. They must really work here because they know that. How can anybody else know that? That those are burned tokens, if you will. Nowadays, you can't use that as trust. And that's something, that's security awareness training, is to let people know, look, that's out there. People are going to know our infrastructure. Those are not sufficient tokens to trust someone anymore. And the same metaphor, like people may agree or disagree with that, but the deepfake thing, that's the exact same thing over and over again. So if somebody can make a video, and they already can, so it's only going to get better, it looks just like your CFO looking you dead in the eye and telling you, I need you to really wire transfer this. It's the same type of thing where you can't trust that video now. We're not going to try to whack-a-mole and kill all that because it's going to happen. So now we need to work around that. When maybe our protocol is very strict and yeah, thank you, ma'am. It's great to hear that, but the protocol, and that's about it on that video call. And the protocol might be some kind of trusted communication channel, maybe something out of band, different from your primary that might be compromised, that they have to go through and say, yes, I really want this, or fill out a form or whatever it may be.
If you're, maybe I've got the tinfoil hat on, but just seeing the deep fakes and the AI impersonation out there, and myself being in a lot of podcasts, being sort of public, like my voice and my mannerisms and my tone, in theory, could just be reproduced. And I'm kind of concerned. I'm talking to my CFO. It's like, okay, like, what do we do? Do we have like a secret handshake or a password or out of band? Because my phone could also be compromised. We've got, of course, we have Mattermost as out of band communications. So I feel we're pretty safe. But at the same time, like when you think about, C-suite, CFOs, CEOs, is there, given the deep fakes out there, is there like a secret handshake, a password? Like is there an easy tool that C-suites can think about around that topic of, what's a burned token versus one that I can still use?
Yeah, I mean, I think under the heat of battle, it's too late, right? I mean, that's what we're getting over and over again. So I think for one, recognizing and just asserting whether, and it doesn't have to be a cybersecurity expert, right? As a risk manager, someone who's thinking through these things, recognizing that scenario can happen. And it's back to the same exact threat profiling adversarial risk management model. So you're worried about wire fraud. Let's see how it happened. There was that case very recently. I forget if the company name was public, but $25 million wire was done because of a deepfake. So study that, play it back. And you don't have to actually, make a deepfake. You could just sit in a meeting room with three people who know the company, subject matter experts, and just talk through. Like, if this happened, do you think one of our AP clerks would have fallen for it? Yeah. Okay, what can we do differently from it? And every company will come up with a different solution. These are business leaders, creative people. If you have an intranet, then maybe you have a rolling, passphrase that's on there, something like that. If you use like an automated workflow in Mattermost, then you can automatically have a rolling secret token that's put in there, like when an incident is generated. So it depends on the environment and what tools that you use and what's available. Or maybe you just come up with a secret word right then and there, and you rotate it once a month, and you have to have that. So I think that there's not a one-size-fits-all to that, but the main thing is just to see what's succeeded somewhere already, and come up with a plan that's going to thwart that. Excellent.
And just for the sort of non-technical, less technical folks out there, can you talk a little bit about what's a tabletop exercise in the cyber world?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The most common usage of that, and the literal definition means you're sitting around in a room, so hence the table, versus in live fire or actually in an actual incident. So that's where the phrase comes from. But the most common usage is nowadays in cyber is around incident response. So when people think about tabletop exercises, it's usually let's just imagine with the GC and the CFO and our communications department, let's imagine that we were ransomware or whatever it may be. You'll have a scenario, a fictitious scenario, and you'll practice well, here's who I call. And someone says, oh, you have the wrong number for them. Oops, okay, good. Learn something. I need to update my contact info. And you go through all that. And in incident response, it goes up to and includes notifying outside counsel, notifying law enforcement, notifying regulators. And you may just say, okay, if this was a real incident, we make a call here. Or in some cases, you may actually call someone, say, hey, sorry to bother you. This is an exercise we're going through. If this was real, here's what we'd be telling you now. Can you tell us what your reaction would be so we can internalize that? So that's, and they call them TTXs, by the way, tabletop exercises. That's the most traditional type of cyber adjacent tabletop exercise. We have a really cool, I think it's a novel idea. I haven't heard a ton about it before, but it seems obvious in hindsight. This idea we call a red team tabletop exercise. And the reason is, as I just fell prey to, I love to tell everyone, oh, you should see what happened somewhere else and red team that. I go, yeah, that sounds great, Jerry, but I went out and it's $40,000 to do that. And then I tell them, well, you should do it once a quarter too. And pretty quickly it's going to die. So the red team TTX, the idea is that for a lot less than $40,000 for free, you could get that threat intelligence. And threat intelligence just means Googling and finding the write-up about what happened, technical write-up. And you can get your head of engineering, a head of DevOps. If you have a security person, great, but you don't need them. CFO in the case of the fraud, and just subject matter experts with institutional knowledge to sit around that table and walk through that report. Have somebody invest some time up front, so a 25-page report gets down to maybe 3 slides or whatever it would be, and just step through it and say, okay, this happened there. Would this work here? Now, the key to that being successful is that everyone has to be candid. And that's an organizational behavior challenge. If you have people that are insecure and worried about being found out, so to speak, then they can get defensive. And they were able to dump all the passwords from every PC because they use the same administrator password. Is that true here, IT head? And you want the IT head to say like, oh yeah, that is true, and not feel guilty. So you have to have a very safe place when you're doing this to say, look, everything's on the table here. Because you might say, okay, well, what you did made sense at the time. Now we've learned that would be a problem. We're going to fix it. Do you need budget? Do you need some help with that? That's no problem. We're going to do it. If instead they just say, oh, no, that's not us. Nah, that couldn't happen here over and over again, then you're not very successful. And that's where the $40,000 independent team that walks all over everybody can sometimes really crack the case there. But with the right culture, you can definitely just do that for free with a tabletop red team exercise.
That's fantastic. There's so much in this first segment that's awesome. I do want to make sure we have time to talk about your career and what you've learned from different experiences. Maybe we can shift gears a little bit and learn about Intercontinental Exchange and your time there, and from 40 people up until it's publicly traded sort of conglomerate. Can you maybe share a little about your journey and as you as the company grew, as you got as you learned more, what was that journey like, and what did you kind of learn from it as it evolved?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great experience in that it was really the best of both worlds on having an entrepreneurial run and being able to be part of something that really grew really quickly, and at the same time have the security and the comfort behind a well-funded company with an amazing mission too. Securing financial markets around the world and running the world's biggest stock exchange and so on. So really fortunate in so many ways to have all of that in one job. And then through the not only M&A, but even the organic growth, we had a lot of being able to just sit in a white room and come up with how to do something no one had ever done before, and not just in security, but in product and in fintech. So that was really phenomenal. What I think when I look back on it, when other people hear about it, I think the most surprising bit was that it just happened that my personal growth and career growth, I got to the right places at the right time to be the right person to continue leading that cybersecurity program. And I don't think that's a comparative superlative thing. I think I could have been a great chief information security officer for phase one of that company's life, but not for the later phase. And I could have went on to be apply those trades somewhere else. And likewise, I could have been the wrong person for the early startup days, but the right one to come in later. So, it really is, I'll just call it coincidence that my trajectory really made it up well where the company was. And while I was the right person for a one-person security team in 2001, that was working with product and trying to actually design the authentication and encryption into our trading platform, that I also happened to become the right person to be a public company CISO talking to a lot of boards and corporate governance and a lot of customers and regulators 20 years later. And again, I don't think that's the saying that everyone should be that and that's what you need to be. It's, again, more really coincidence than anything else. So that worked out really well because it nurtured my career growth. And I guess I was kind of and still fancy myself, a governance nerd. I liked the idea. I liked reading through the legislation and distilling from the Federal Register comments down to the actual code and trying to manifest that so that I didn't just respond to innuendo, but really knew exactly what was required by the law and could tailor our program to it. And then look, the culture of the company was really key too. And I always debate whether, so I was allowed to run, so to speak. I had a lot of autonomy. As we did M&A, a lot of times I'd be one of the first people on the ground into the company after the deal was closed. And, who are you? Oh, I'm the chief information security officer. That's kind of weird. And I'm meeting people and I'm just book my own travel and go. And what I wrestle with sometimes is I wonder how much of that was the culture and the company being very empowering. I think it was. I think there was a whole lot of, we want to hire the right people and let them run. But there was also just, we grew up together, right? I mean, there's also just, no matter how great you are, it takes a while before you trust someone to that level and you're going to let them represent your company, walking through a door somewhere, or speak publicly or talk to a regulator. And using an example of that, and we'll probably touch on this in a bit, but after I left and while I was really forming the idea and putting the flesh on the bones about adversarial risk management, I did a lot of consulting and advisory work where I experienced for smaller companies that weren't big public companies what works and what doesn't around cybersecurity and risk management, which was great. And kind of the flagship of that whole path was Silicon Valley Bank. And I went into there before the implosion that they had in March of 23. So just at the beginning of 23, I went in to help them because they had gotten, they had grown into a designated large financial institution, taken on a lot of regulatory oversight from the Federal Reserve. And there was a lot of catch up that they needed to do, and they had hired a lot of people. And so I went in there. And comparing culturally, and again, I can't say what part of this is culture and what is just rapport, but there was a lot more hesitation about, God forbid anyone talk directly to the regulator without a lot of handlers in the room, and there was a lot more consensus and indecisiveness, and we need to have a lot more committees around this, and okay, that sounds great, wait, hold on, let's just wait another month, let's just double check this, and it was a lot harder to get things done. And again, I don't know how much of that was cultural versus how much is like half of my 300-person team at Silicon Valley Bank had been there for less than 9 months when I started. So there was a whole lot of, and it's bilateral insecurity. It's not only you don't necessarily trust the new people to be ready yet, but the new people don't trust themselves. And so they're not going to make, big sweeping decisions quite yet.
Yeah, Silicon Valley Bank, just I living in Palo Alto, being right next to it and, having our accounts there was, it was very different. The day that the sort of failure was happening, all of us as founders that have bank accounts there were trying to move things around. I remember standing at one of those systematically important banks and having someone behind me in line trying to cash a $200 million cashier's check.
That's great.
And I'm just, that was on the outside. So what was it like on the inside? Like what was, what would you share with other, what was it like on the inside? And what are learnings that you'd pass on to other C-suites as they think about, these very extraordinary times, these outliers?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I'll immediately say that, while it was an extremely stressful experience actually before the collapse of the bank. It was just a high pressure environment. Like I said, they had grown so fast and mainly because of external regulatory pressure more than anything else. It wasn't customer pressure. It wasn't that they were having operational challenges or difficulty keeping up. That wasn't it. It was more just, okay, now you're playing with the big boys, and so you're going to have to come up to snuff on this. And I think everyone was really scrambling to do that. So the worst of it was really the months leading up, before that. And I would say I didn't witness anything, whether culturally or operationally, that correlated with the failure. So, and everyone has second guessed it. Maybe some of us who worked there put more time into it because it was close to home. But as far as like the actual mechanics of the collapse and the run on the bank and the treasury management and the capital management, there's nothing about that sequence of events that ties directly to the observation and experience that I have, however stressful they may have been. But nonetheless, going into a large bank and one that's grown very quickly was a whole learning experience in itself. Now, going through receivership and having the FDIC come in and ask for all the armed guards to come up front and hand over their firearms and leave the building, that was a unique experience as well as all the security protocol, like stripping it all down because the new boss called the FDIC says so, and being able to grant access for auditing and and having laptops taken and imaged and all of that kind of thing, overnight. That was something you'll never experience, at any other time possibly. But in general, I'd say that most of the learnings around that were really organizational, and like I hearkened to earlier, you can grow too fast, and I don't think that that's limited to cybersecurity or even risk management. It's the classic startup story too. If you raise too much money, if you have $100 million and ostensibly your investors want you to realize your dream in the next 9 to 18 months, you're going to go out to the market and hire fast. And what happens when you hire fast? You're not going to have that personal relationship. A's hire A's and B's hire C's. They say, well, you're going to pick up some B's and C's when you're rushing through all of that. And then when the people get in there, they're all kind of staring at each other like, well, what's your name? What's your background? Why are you here? And you have duplication. And we had a ton of that at SVB, where, I was on a speed dating, meeting everybody possible around the world. And it felt like every day I met more people with the exact same title as the ones I had met the day before, and who were all blockers and people that you needed to go through to get things done. And I thought we had that covered. There were so many. We used to joke. So financial services, you have the classic 3 lines of defense model, and we used to joke and call it the 17 lines of defense, because that's really what it felt like. There's so many risk management layers in there. So one of the things I learned there is that you can grow too fast, and when you're onboarding, again, whether it's cyber or risk or just business in general, there's something to be said for throttling the scale a little bit, so that the people that you bring in, you can actually inculcate and get into and empower, so that they can then grow the company. And without that, it can be paralyzing. Hiring those 200 new employees doesn't mean you're done. There could be 190 of them just eating up payroll and sitting around waiting to be told what to do.
That is a very crazy moment. Sorry, can you just say a little bit more about the FDIC and the security guards and the firearms? I was like...
Well, yeah, the FDIC does this a lot. Receivership, I didn't know that beforehand, but if you look online, when you're the one going through receivership, sometimes you have to go to the internet and quick get the latest. And when you do, you kind of get through this table of which receivership would you like to inquire about? And you realize it's fairly common. It's not every day, but several a quarter, let's say, banks that they step into that are becoming insolvent, and the FDIC takes it over, generally to ensure the solvency of the depositors, right? Every regulator has a constituency. That's another key point I think people overlook a lot of times. They're not just altruistic, all of them. Some are looking for shareholders. Some are looking out for depositors in this case. Some are looking out for the general public, like the FTC. So the FDIC is only worried about the depositors, and they do this fairly regularly. And I remember at some point in that first week or right after that happened, I remember saying, half jokingly, the FDIC is awesome at M&A. Because having done it so many times, and I felt like our teams at ICE in particular, I always said we were aggressive integrators. And I thought that was a core competency that we had. We could buy a company, and when we bought the International Petroleum Exchange in London in 2001. And we had less than 200 people at the time. I was 24 years old, fly to London, go into an open outcry trading floor for the first time in my life, all the jackets, people screaming and yelling, trading crude oil. And I was petrified. And I think that was a pretty good metaphor for how the whole company felt to some degree. We weren't going to go in there and be an aggressive integrator and tell them how to run oil markets, right? We were much more gun shy. And it took us 3 or 4 years to really integrate, electronify, migrate things from open outcry to the screen. We kept doing it though. So in 2007, we did the same thing with the New York Board of Trade. By contrast, literally the day that the deal closed, we lit up all of those open outcry markets, and we're talking agricultural commodities there, and we lit them all up on the screen so they could be traded electronically on the day of the close. That's insanely aggressive, unheard of. And then fast forward to 2013, we bought the New York Stock Exchange. Everyone thought we were nuts. While we were a $12, $13 billion market cap public company already, it was still a coup, and people who had never heard of ICE were suddenly hearing about it, reading about it in the Wall Street Journal. And there was this general idea of like, well, how are some upstarts from Atlanta going to be able to take over the New York Stock Exchange? And we had a swagger about us. We recognize there are some things that are always different about every business, and certainly true when you go into listings and public companies. But when it comes to market function and mechanics, we knew that inside and out, and we knew the right questions to ask, right? So I think that aggressive integrator was really important. And as you become a larger and larger company, that's harder. It's harder culturally. There's a lot more, let's be careful. Let's treat people with the kid glove, so to speak. But bring us back to the FDIC. With that background, my observations were, wow, the FDIC is a really aggressive integrator. Because not only would they take all the guns and get all the guards in, but they completely shut down ACH. So, ACH payments immediately. They've been down this road so many times, they know what people do when it comes to getting cash out really quick. And when you buy a company, no matter how aggressive you are, No one's like that. Inevitably, 2 months, 6 months into it, people will look back and say, "Oh, I wish we had ratcheted down this account," or "Look at this employee was spending like crazy the minute that we bought it," or "Look, they hired 15 people the day before we inked the deal. They just snuck them in under the wire." Things like that always happen. Not with the FDIC. So I call him an aggressive integrator. And there is collateral damage, and there was collateral damage. And I suspect that if you were trying to move money around, when you evaluated whether to humor them and say, "Okay, yeah, I'll leave it at SCB," there's probably a point where you said, "Oh, but I can't pay my employees through ACH." And that was why, because that was frozen. Definitely collateral damage. But there's got to be some learnings to be had from it. And maybe everybody needs like one person from the FDIC on their integration team.
That's amazing and eye-opening. Like that is, yeah. So I think everyone's going to be hiring those folks, when they think about like that skill set. Maybe just, I know we're kind of running down on time, and I would love to talk about this one other topic we discussed before, and you kind of brought it up, which is kind of payroll and operations, and what does it mean to be critical infrastructure? So when you think about in the context of sort of adversarial risk management and the business that you're in, there's sort of the mainstream, what's happening in the news, and then there's critical infrastructure, which is a different segment. I'm curious, how you would, as a C-suite, think about educating those other leaders about what is the difference between sort of like a regular company and something that's critical infrastructure, and how do you think about risk management in that really specific sense? And maybe just one more thing, which is thinking about it on the sense of public safety and national security beyond sort of day-to-day commerce. Like, how do you think about critical infrastructure on a sort of a national or international scale?
Sure. I'll take that two ways. I'll take it as like the proper noun and common noun. So the term critical infrastructure, it's important for people to know that there is kind of a proper noun. There's a formal designation. It's based on which country, but I know in the United States in particular, we have that, where, let's see, by executive order, the sector-specific agencies, so for example, the Department of Treasury for financial services and the Department of Energy for energy, were tasked with studying their sector, the private entities and commercial entities in their sector, and determining which ones were deemed critical infrastructure. And so through that exercise, there's an official list, and you're either on it or you're not. And if you are, you find out in a very awkward way. You actually just get a letter in the mail addressed to the CEO. But that's a very small list. So for example, in financial services, out of thousands of entities, it was, last I checked, less than 50 entities. So it's a pretty small list. And that's important for a few reasons. The biggest one being that you'll see a lot of regulation and particular disclosure requirements out of like the Department of Homeland Security that are in the public light, but they may only apply to critical infrastructure. And if that's the case, it's those proper noun critical infrastructure designated entities. Now, and so they need to be careful, and not everyone needs to assume that everything applies to them because they're important. Importance is different from critical infrastructure. I'll talk about that more than just the specific designated entities. So when I think about that, that's where that threat profile model is so important, because one thing we dealt with as critical infrastructure was that the news headlines, whether it was Equifax, or the Home Depot breach, or Yahoo, or on, were always data theft. And whether it was our board directors or whether it was the questionnaires coming in from our prospective customers, everything equated cybersecurity with data and data security. And that's really like an emotional tickler for the general public, because most people deal with cybersecurity if their identity might be stolen. So privacy and data in particular is equated with cybersecurity for them. In critical infrastructure, it wasn't the case. Sometimes data has something to do with it. In espionage, it does, but a lot of it has to do with availability. And what my ex-boss used to call the lobbing in a grenade attack, as if to say, look, persistence isn't necessarily required there. It's totally different to just cause massive destruction on a geopolitical scale. And so that's something that we as critical infrastructure really paid attention to. And we were trying to say, how do we tailor our cyber program to those more destructive and sabotage type critical infrastructure attacks without looking dismissive of this massive media narrative about data theft and the industry, right? The vendors are all geared towards encryption at rest and data security, trying to sell that, and they get a lot of big microphones, and so before you know it, you have the CEO asking about that. What are we doing about data security? I hear that's the big thing, and the answer again is not, oh, that's not important. It's putting it in context and explaining why, while you've identified your data security risk and you care about it, we're really focused on sabotage or whatever it may be. So, going back to that idea of threat modeling or establishing the threat profile, and then tying specific controls and priorities to that to say, if you care about sabotage, then you need to worry more about whatever was used in the attack last week, is really key, just so that you can narrow down your aperture and really focus on the few things that are going to move the needle today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jerry. This has been an amazing conversation, and I really appreciate it. I feel like we almost ran out of time, but there's so many more topics I'd love to talk to you about. But thank you so much for joining us today. And where would people find you on social media and other channels?
Oh, sure, sure. Well, fortunately, my last name is pretty unique, so it's easy to Google me on almost anything. But I've really consolidated all of my blogging and talks into adversarial.com, and there's a prominent content link on there where I have not only my own podcast, Life After CISO, but also just general thoughts and help for people that are going down the same cybersecurity risk management path.
Thanks so much for listening. If you like this content, please join our LinkedIn group. Please thumbs up, please comment, please subscribe. We'd love to bring more of this content to you.